Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. Welcome to part 5 of this series, Unlocking the Giza Plateau, Ancient Science of Astronomy, Geometry and Metrology of the Pyramids. But how the pyramid plan on the famous 3 Giza Pyramids applies to the other pyramids along the Giza Plateau, down to Lake Moeris, but also how it extends far past that and way down to the very southern borders of Egypt. So pyramids, temples, actually Egypt is the Nile, and the flood cycle, the 3 seasons of Egypt. Akhet, the flood; Peret, the emergence cycle; and Shemu, the dry or harvest season, was the pulse of Egyptian life. And that the Egyptian religion, if read through texts such as the pyramid text, coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead, are actually telling this story. Literally, the field of reeds or marsh of reeds, the Egyptian afterlife, was a mirror image of life itself. So the Egyptian religion afterlife can only really be understood if you understand the Egyptian pulse of life, the biology of the Nile, and how that was so influential on everything. It was nature insisted on it. You had to be in tune with nature, and that their religion, far from being one more mystical, was based on the natural rhythms of life. Their gods were the gods of the Nile, the sky, the air, the water, etc. So essentially it was an animist religion. But this is a high Aswan Dam completed in 1970. It changed everything. The eternal pulse of it, not the eternal, but for thousands and thousands of years, the Nile, the annual flooding cycle, had been the breadth and the heartbeat, the pulse of all Egyptian life. This is how it used to be. This is what influenced them. It's clear in their texts. It's clear in their, as we'll see, also in their architecture and the archaeoastronomy of their architecture. And we'll be examining some of that more in detail later. But so previous episodes been looking at the 3 pyramids, the pyramid plan, or we also went to Abydos and Thebes and found that the same plan is in there. It's archaeoastronomy. It's the all-important angles of the pyramids in regards to Akhet and the summer solstice, the first day of the new year. But now let's look even further south to the Ombo Temple and Elephantine Island. So just below there, Elephantine Island, is the high Aswan Dam, and the cataracts are just below that. The cataracts were basically rapids where rocks and lots of islands, so it was a natural border that separated Egypt from Nubia. And so we had Lower Egypt, we had Upper Egypt, and then we had the cataracts which formed the border. Now we'll look at that a little bit more, but the difference, the way that nature influenced Lower Egypt, and that the different nature of life and geology, the biome in Upper Egypt, and how those were separated too. But the Egyptian border, Elephantine, was really the southern point of Egypt. So here we have a view of it. So there's the Elephantine Islands and the temples, and you can see the cataracts here. It's a perfect defensive position for people coming down the Nile. It's also a border for trade. So essentially from Elephantine and all the way to the Nile Delta, the river is just a smooth course. There's no rapids, waterfalls. There are a few little obstructions, but it's essentially it's a freeway all the way down. But above the cataracts, there's a sudden rise in elevation, and it's a natural defensive place, and of course it will form a natural border. As the crow flies, about quite a distance. So, but if you actually follow the river, and even there I'm using a lot of straight lines, so it's even longer, but it's 930 kilometers. So you're looking at over 500 miles roughly from Elephantine just to Heliopolis, not including the delta itself. It's a huge area, distance to travel, and of course how to manage such a large area as well. But so there we have Elephantine and the cataracts, and not too far up we have this Ombo Temple. The temple itself was completed just before the Ptolemaic era, so around about the 4th, 5th century BC, before the Greek period of rule. But the temple also includes this very important calendar, At Elephantine, we also have his calendar. Now, Elephantine, what was his name? I forget. There was lots and lots of destruction there, so they've rebuilt some of it, but we have a lot of bits and pieces and shards, and that also includes this calendar. And this is very important to Egyptian culture. Also, we have some of the oldest surviving Nilometers. So this is Elephantine Island, and you see these marks. The Nile flood was, the level of the flood that year would set the tax for that year. If the flood was too low, they knew that the crops wouldn't grow. It could be a famine. If the flood was too high, it would wash away most of Egypt. We think stone, but it was mainly mud bricks. So walls, houses, other temples would be washed away. The infrastructure of Egypt would be, if the flood was too high. So the flood was everything. If you're not including the flood, you're just not looking at the reality of what it was for the Egyptians. And these Nilometers, even later they were built throughout, even well after Egypt collapsed as a civilization, and you entered the Byzantine, the Christian, and the Islamic era. They're still building Nilometers. It was if you're living on the Nile up until the dam, the flood was everything. And so here we see some of these. Now, in the past, the Nilometers were restricted to essentially inside temple precincts to priests. It was a special area. Other people could just make a stick and mark it, but the Nilometers were also a very sacred thing, and it has to do, because it has to do with measuring the water. It would be linked to Thoth and Shesset, these important gods, which we'll be examining more. This is a Palermo stone. There are a few pieces stored around the world. It's called the Palermo stone because it's of the largest pieces is in the Palermo Museum in Italy. There we see a smaller fraction, and each one of these blocks represents 1 year, and at the bottom of each year, in cubits, palms and fingers, it records the level of the Nile. They were recording this meticulously. Everything revolved around it. So there we see the pieces of a Palermo stone. Now, whether it was copied from an older stone is, some would say yes or no, but what we have is a very, very important, one of the most important documents regarding Old Kingdom Egypt. Unlike the King's List, which is a Temple of Seti I, which was written quite some time later and doesn't include a lot of kings, it tends to get a lot of the attention. It's actually the Palermo stone and some of these other King's Lists which are more important. For instance, as it's referred to as the Royal Annals. And the last king mentioned is Unas. King Narmer, also Narmer and Menes are sometimes thought to be the same, but he's considered the first king of Egypt. Well, we have kings earlier to him recorded on this Palermo stone, and also records very important ceremonies, of course, the annual flood cycle, very important. So Unas is at the very end. King Unas was the first to write the pyramid texts. So, and these are, it's an essential document, but we see that this is, the pyramid text only began with the end of the records of the Palermo stone. So Narmer, or Menes, this is the famous Narmer palette, which shows King Narmer defeating, he was from Upper or Southern Egypt, he defeated Lower Egypt and united the kingdom. So that raises an important question as well, because Lower Egypt, and then we have Upper Egypt. Well, if Egypt began with King Narmer who united Lower and Upper Egypt, therefore two kingdoms or nations were already existing. So it tends to be that Egyptian civilization started with Narmer. Well, Lower Egypt or Upper Egypt separately are very large, vast areas that require a sophisticated bureaucracy to manage. This is not some little fiefdom. This is and so there were two kingdoms, nations before, yet it tends to be this, I would say, very arbitrary date to date to 3000 BC in King Narmer, the beginning of Egyptian civilization. Amongst other things, it records stretching the cord ceremony, which I mentioned, focused on in part 1 of this series. I'll come back to, because this is again an essential element. This very old, the alignment of temples. Shesset presided over the pharaoh who would, when he created a new temple, the alignments of that, the archeoastronomy of that, aligning it to Mesketu or the Big Dipper, therefore to the north, ever so important. symbols of Shesset, the very old ones as compared to the later. So the Polymer Stone lists King Narmer. Before him it lists King Scorpion and King Ka, as well as Scorpion 1 and Iri Hor. But we also have artifacts bearing those names, and even the Scorpion one, well, he's got the adze, the 7-pointed star petals there, and I would say that this is very similar to the stretching the cord ceremony, where the king would dig a trench to the water table around a new temple, but that's stretching it a little bit. But before King Narmer, we have records that the Egyptians left us, and also artifacts to, again, suggest there's older kings than this. So stretching the cord ceremony, the Polymer Stone, which of course they also list Causeway. There's above the door jamb in granite, it actually shows the picture of the stretching the cord ceremony. That's the oldest surviving image, but we also have some other references to that as well. And the later images and descriptions of stretching the cord match the older ones, which makes a very strong case that this was definitely unbroken, but the details of the actual ceremony itself. So, for instance, Shesset, and again at the bottom block of each one of these is a cubit, that's an arm, and fingers, and so one cubit was divided into 7 palms, each palm was divided into 4 fingers, therefore one cubit equals 28 fingers, but they meticulously recorded the Nile Flood. This was essential. Stretching the cord and Shesset. Shesset, and as along with Thoth, is often shown with his palm frond. She was the inventor of writing. She's always shown with writing instruments. This palm frond strip was used as a tally stick, and it was also connected to the Hebsed festival, which was a really important festival. So a pharaoh had to rule for 30 years to be allowed the privilege to have this festival, and it would be granted to him by Shesset, because Shesset kept the records. She was the record keeper, royal records, the lady of the scribes, the mistress of the house, the goddess of librarians and record keeping. This is a ivory with King Den running the Hebsed festival. You even see this palm frond here. Now that literally means a year. That's time. It's also, so King Den, the years of King Den are listed. We also have the flood cycle. There's a few other interesting pieces. Again, the palm frond, which represents time in various forms. That's from Gardner's book. It's also in Budge, Hieroglyph Dictionary. Shesset, of course, palm fronds. Shesset, the goddess of wisdom. She was the inventor of writing. Thoth taught it to humanity. She invented it. And even see that this symbol with the double palm fronds, a great but infinite number. Also the frog, that represents, the tadpole, sorry, represents 100,000. But yeah, there's a math for geometry and astronomy based in these records and symbols. Again, the great but indefinite number. She was the goddess of accounting and all other elements. So palm frond, time, counting, everything scholarly, academic was related to Thoth or to Shesset, and Shesset has been forgotten. She really was a superior to Thoth in many ways. King Scorpion, again you can see the adze, which is a nice reference to astronomy in there as well as this symbol, which is also on the Narmer palette, but that's not relevant for the moment. So each one of these boxes has that palm frond representing 1 year of the flood. The year is counted. Akhet, the inundation series, inundation season, flood season, and those which are just linked to this architecture, to this archaeoastronomy as well. Again, very important to measure and measure again. So back to Komombo and the Elephantine Temple complex. The calendar Komombo is one of the best preserved, but of course there is earlier evidence of this, but what we have is the Egyptian year of 12 months of 30 days, or 360 days, which was 3 seasons of 120 days, or 360 days, plus a 5-day intercalary period to give you a 365-day calendar system. This is what's called a lunisolar calendar. So a lunar year, which is used by many cultures still, is based on 12 full moons. But a full moon is not 30 days, it's 29.53. So a lunar year is essentially 354 days. A solar year is 365, again, plus each one has plus a fraction, but just to round it off to simplify it, 354 days and 365. For 360 days is a midpoint between those. It's a lunisolar calendar. It's a compromise between a lunar and a solar calendar. Lunar cycles are ever so important, but if you rely on lunar cycles to create your year, your New Year's Day is going to fall out of line with solstice or equinox, for instance, and before you know it, your summer months will have shifted over into other seasons. So that's why it's important to have a solar year, but also have a lunar year, because to time animals will time themselves to the lunar calendar. Also, lots of traditional farming techniques rely on planting crops on a certain lunar period, whether it's a half moon, new moon, or the full moon. And so both of these have been so important. Of course, both sun, earth, and moon are intrinsic to nature. So that's why this calendar of 360 days, and it's just nice that that's also lunar year, then 355, 356, 357, 358, 359, and then 360, and then you add your other 5 days to get your solar year. Both this calendar and the flood are not just Egyptian, they also relate to this very other important ancient society, and that's the Sumerians and the Chaldeans and Babylonians. But Egypt was based on the Nile. Sumer, Babylon, Chaldea are based on the Tigris and Euphrates river system. Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, all along the Nile. Then we have Sumer, which was the southern part of the Tigris Euphrates. And what they do is that, so all the Grand Pyramids, now forget, is it all Hun? So all the Grand Pyramids are all just above the canal entrance to the Moris Lake, up to the Great Pyramid, and then Abu Rawash. So along this strip are all of the Great Pyramids. There is one on the other side of the river. There are a few in Sudan. But when you think of those, and there are of course many, many smaller pyramids, structures all up and down Egypt. When you think of those big Grand Pyramids, they're all on this bank of the Nile, on the west bank, and they go from the canal to Lake Moris up to Abu Rawash, in just on the other side of Cairo. But Lower Egypt and Sumer were marshland people. They lived on the delta and lakes. They had when you think Egypt, you tend to think desert. Well, there's a huge marsh area of which is Lower Egypt, the delta, Lake Moris, and the Sumerians were exactly the same. They were in a marshland bordered by desert. The Nile and the cycle has been changed since the 70s. We've lost the flood cycle. Dams on the Euphrates and Tigris have changed the natural water cycle. The draining of the marshes in the 50s and 90s in Iraq has again changed the environment of what Egypt is now, what Lower Egypt and the whole Nile, but of course what was Sumer has also been, the landscape, the natural rhythm of life has been changed. You can see old pictures before. The major infrastructure programs, drainage and large-scale agriculture. The flood was, just like the Egyptians, the Sumerians relied on the annual flood rather than rainfall. And again, those archaeoastronomy, and of course this can be just evident in their ancient stories and rhythms. So the Nile flood arrives in midsummer because it's coming from really far away. It has to trickle through marshes before it eventually forms the Nile River, and so the Nile flood arrives in midsummer. As with essentially every other culture, they would have their spring flood, and that's what happened in Sumer. So Sumer's flood was in the spring, the Nile flood was in summer. Annual flood cycle essential, the basis of their agriculture, economy, mythology, folk stories. The rivers were the highways, the spine of their nations in both cases, and the annual flood was the heartbeat by which they lived in both cases. Of course, one was summer solstice, and for the Sumerians, it would have been the spring equinox, which would have been linked to the arrival of the flood. Apart from this riverine culture built on the annual flood cycle, they both shared a calendar of 360 plus 5 days, or 12 months of 30 days plus 5-day calendar. Now, we'll get more into this in future episodes, is going to be an important point, because also there was, so whether it's Palmyra, Joresh, or Petra, which are now more famous for the Roman buildings there, but these were ancient springs, so on the edge of a desert, which were trading outposts. And again, they were still, up until very recently, so important to the trade of the area. But of course, you could just move up the river and down the Fertile Crescent borders Lower Egypt. If you draw a circle around Lower Egypt, they're closer to current day Israel and Jordan than what they are to places such as Elephantine or Khanoom Temple. They're closer to places such as Cyprus. Lower Egypt was a watery marshland connected directly to the Mediterranean. All of these surrounding cultures and trade was much closer to the pyramids and Heliopolis and current day Cairo than what was Lower Egypt. So, and of course, these people were around since very, very long time ago, and also a necessity to trade goods. And where you trade goods, you trade information. But both Sumer and Egypt as a whole were poor in timber. So their furniture that they find in the tombs and elsewhere in the records, they did not grow this timber here. It had to be imported from far away. So it was one of the reasons both these people sought to control current day Syria, Lebanon, the red cedars of Lebanon, for instance, which is so important in ancient tradition as well. But when you trade goods, you trade ideas. They had the same calendar. It's now more accepted that there was a trade of information. So from the very earliest days of recorded Sumer in Egypt, and also the sexagesimal system of the Sumerians, Babylonians, they counted in groupings of 60. And well, that's evident to us that still affects us now, because that's where the 60 minutes per hour, 60 seconds per minute on the clock, and the 360-degree compass, 60 minutes per degree or 60 seconds per minute of the compass. Now we do it in decimal, but that's how they used to measure angles. For instance, a pyramid angle is 51 degrees and 51 minutes. Now we just tend to use a decimal, 51.84 degrees. But this is the impact that these ancient cultures had on us, and it's very evident. Oldest surviving Egyptian sundials, 1500 to 1000 BC, they divided the day into 12 units. Although the pyramid and coffin texts, and literally it's on the inside of these coffins, show they divided the night into 12 units, and that goes back as 2800 BC. So the 12-hour day and the 12-hour night, or the 24-hour day, is linked to these ancient systems and linked. And this will be more important, because once you go, well, did they have an hour? Yes, they definitely had an hour. Were they dividing that into minutes and seconds? There's no clear evidence of that, but I'll come back to this, because once you apply, let's assume they did, and look at the angles in certain places, what you find is an absolute symphony of perfect coincidence, which just links everything, the cycles of time, into beautiful, beautiful numbers. But so the Egyptian astronomy, 36 decans of 10, so 360 days. So their week was 10 days times 36. Then you would add the 5 days. But also these circles are divided into 24 divisions, like the 24-hour day. Now that's a lovely link. So how do you divide a circle into 24 units? Well, you use the vesica and the seed of life, the same geometry which we can find in the Osirion, and they had exactly the same inherent beautiful geometry in Sumer and Babylon as well. So back to down south, and we have the Komombo Temple and the Elephantine Temple. At Elephantine, we have the Temple of Khanoom. He was the god of the source of the Nile River. The Egyptians, for them, surely they had expeditions further up. They knew the Nile went further. They knew Nubians were there, but like in a symbolic sense, this was considered the source of the Nile. Now, Komombo, Ombos, the goddess of the first season, Akhet, the first season of the Egyptian New Year, beginning on the summer solstice, marking the flood. All these arc words, which are translated in such a different way in pyramid texts online, etc., are actually all related to water and flood in an exquisite way. And of course, the New Year's symbol, New Year's Day, it's just a variation of the Akhet symbol for the beginning of the summer solstice, or the Egyptian New Year, the beginning of a flood season. So back to Elephantine, Khufu's full name is Khanoom Khufway. So Khanoom is my protector. That's Khufu's full name. Another center of Khanoom was the Esna. You see him, the flood, literally, again, just in a nice symbolic fashion. New Year's Day, now even the symbol for the, it's listed next to New Year's Day in Budge's hieroglyphic dictionary. So, but instead of the sun, we see the Jed pillar. The oldest texts call, for instance, the Great Pyramid Akhet Khufu, or horizon. Okay, but horizon is a multi-layered word. Even still, you're looking to new horizons. It's a the symbol for horizon is literally the symbol for the flood season of Akhet. Akhet, horizon, Akhet, flood. Yeah. So this image shows the sun going down between two mountains. It's not very picturesque of a horizon would be a plain, but again, it's one of these references, and most people just don't think about the flood on both sides of the fence. Okay, Nilometers, the importance of the flood and the Nile, Akhet, Ombos, Komombo, literally these places were, dedicated to Nile and flood gods. Close up of Elephantine, again we see the actual cataracts and still there, and natural barrier for trade, the rapids, the rocks jutting out, the islands of these cataracts was the natural border between Egypt and Nubia. So just off to the side, that's Aswan High Dam, is just a little bit off the bottom of the screen. We see the Aswan quarries with so much quarrying work. They show the leftover tool marks and trade show how they were doing it, but that's the unfinished obelisk. But plenty of obelisks were finished from there, and the quarry marks and their methods is not really. It's like literally it's there, but mystery cells. Okay, Elephantine Temple itself and Archeoastronomy. Along with sites such as at Abydos, at Thebes, Komombo, here at Elephantine, most of those structures were built a little bit later, but built on much older foundations. It's just as is the case, you build over the top of a new and improved, but it's the foundations. And so we have the main Khanoom temple complex, but also we have these around them. So for instance, over the side here, it's 28 degrees. Over here at the top, 28 degrees. So for instance, follow this line, it even goes through the corner of this other temple, which would have that same alignment. That's pointing this way, and I would think that because this converges on this corner, that's probably a 0 point there of the larger complex. Would be, this is a nice converging place. It could be, but just at a glance. But what we have is summer solstice, sunset. Viewed through here, we would see the summer solstice sunrise. Opposite direction, winter solstice sunset, and the winter solstice sunrise. We have, and summer solstice sunset or sunrise, New Year. here comes the flood. And we just superimpose it on the Giza plan to the 0 point. It's the same thing, it's all over. So earlier, again, we saw that at Thebes, for instance, and so many other places. Ever so important, that was back in part 3. But again, there's more to come on that, because there's some really amazing links between the pyramids and the all-important site at Heliopolis. But summer solstice from the 0 point at northwest corner, Causeway Valley Temple, sun sets between the two of the largest pyramids there. That's the symbol for the new year, is the same as Akhet, just with frond on top signifying year or time. And also we have, viewed from the 0 point, you see this photo is a little bit, you see a little bit of a side from the 0 point. You only see the profile of the Causeway Valley Causeway Pyramid, which gives you the angles of the seasons and 3, 4, 5 triangles. But also from the side, we only see the corner of the pyramid. And as I went into the last couple episodes, how important that is and how important these angles will be, 42 and 48 degrees. 360 days, 360 degrees, and we'll examine this more. But once you have how these angles connect to the larger system of timekeeping, it is a symphony of coincidence that's like the ring cycle. It goes on for a very long time. But now if you focus in on the main complex there, on the mound, so it sits above the floodwaters, even higher than the surrounding parts, and that angle, 48 or 42 degrees off axis, 42 and 48 again. See this complex, that's not the one, sorry, so not that one we already saw was 28 degrees. So basically we're following this wall or these walls, and now we have this one which is offset slightly, and that too is at 48 and 42 degrees. It's just swapped over from the last. So 48 at the bottom, 42 at the top, and 42 at the bottom, 48 at the top. So they're 6 degrees separated from each other. Back to the Giza complex, Causeway's 6-degree tilt, which follows the wall of the crow. The pyramid itself, center to the peak, 6 degrees. Also the difference between 48 and 42 degrees. In the corner angles is 6 degrees, and we see this solar year line, where since the 3, 4, 5 triangle and other evidence that they were thinking in Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, ever like an essential discovery which relates to so many aspects, but therefore it would be a 2 to 19. Now why 2 and 19? Because if that was 1, then that would be 9.5. So these are the first whole numbers that you can use, and again it's 6.009 degrees. But what you do is you create the hypotenuse, therefore is the square root of 365. And for instance, in the Ramesseum there was a golden disc that Diodorus tells us had a circumference of 360 cubits, and also in the pyramids, but yes, so much coincidence in regards to this math, geometry, astronomy. But that 6-degree angle, of course, that leaves 84, so 42 is the bisector. Yeah, it's and of course all the others. So the flood, Akhet, the rhythm of life, and we can both in the living world, which was reflected in their afterlife in the Marsh of Reeds, and again all the ancient texts tell us this quite explicitly, that the 3 seasons of life which was revolved around the flood was repeated in the afterworld. So Archeoastronomy, and now I'll link these 2 papers. I'm just going to show you the breakdown of them. And so for instance we see these 2 images. Now the one on the right here is important, as you notice the Maltese cross form of a typical diagram of astronomical orientations with a preference for cardinal and solar orientation. So what Juan Belmonte and his team, Mazalam Shaltout and Magdi Fekri, they went and they studied hundreds and hundreds of sites all across Egypt, from the lower to upper Egypt, in the desert and oases region, also down into Nubia, and so they've just plotted these out. So there we see the original, and there we can see how there is a, well, it's evident, there's, and especially, so whatever's like east would also reflect on west. So even though there's a lot of points here, this essentially should be reflected on the other side, because if you line it to the east, therefore you also align it to the west. So whether it's sunrise or sunset, once you've done it in one direction, you'll get the other. So over 330 Egyptian temples, now he's just charted them out, and so northeast, southeast, equinox, and winter solstice, again, WS, so again, whatever's on winter solstice will align to summer. So winter solstice sunrise is summer solstice sunset. But we see these spikes. So again, as he said, there are indisputable evidence of an intentional astronomical orientations. As again, stretching the chord serum, Shesset, we look towards Mesketu, then we orientate the corners, the angles of our temples. That's again in the text, and it's becoming more and more accepted, because based on evidence such as this, if you take a few small samples, you can say it's coincidence or that it was unique to this particular site. If you look at the larger scale and you see that obviously there are spikes here, this is a random, doesn't happen randomly. It's very important. Winter solstice. So for instance, to the pyramids, I've been using the 0-point winter solstice sunset, equinox sunset, and sunset on the summer solstice, New Year, the Akhet season, but that would just be winter solstice sunrise if we go in the opposite direction. So again, these equinox sunrise, he's orientated them there, but they would also be reflected on to the west at sunset. East sunrise, sunsets in the west. So if you have one, you essentially have the other. Now these orientations, so we have equinox, again this clear spike. On the solstice we have clear spikes. We also have these others now. Sopdet or Sophis or Sirius was a very important star. It's the brightest star in the sky, and Canopus is the second brightest star. And he's been looking at these, and of course equinox, solstice evident. Actually, that one should be, okay. Well, I shall go into that more. But one of the reasons, actually, just to query that, I did. It's actually not 14 degrees. It's something, but it will come back to that. But let's. One of the reasons, so for instance, from the 0-point Khafre Valley Causeway bisects the angle between spring equinox and summer solstice. This is repeated again in other sites, for instance Heliopolis and others. But why would this 14 degrees be important? Because it gives you a 45-day warning prior to solstice that the flood's coming. So during the bulk of the year, people are working and farming on these floodplains. They've got their houses, their camps, their animals, everything is built around there. Now you don't want to wake up one morning and find that there's been an early spring thaw down in Ethiopia and in the Congo, and that the flood arrives early. You want to be sure, so you want a warning before the flood comes. It's not going to arrive like clockwork every year. It might come a little bit early, it might come a little bit late, but it's also the beginning of summer, so that the heat is going to get very, very important feature as well. So one of the relieving factors of having a late flood that arrives in summer is that it arrives in summer just when you need it in this very, very, you're on the edge of the Sahara, it's very hot. He's also pointing out Sirius and Canopus alignments. Sirius, brightest star in the sky, Canopus, and so there is Orion belt. These are the brightest stars, so one where would you do it? Again, the shaft alignments with the pyramid pointing to Sirius and Orion's belt, being another connection. Now, in the past, around about 3000 BC, Sirius would disappear for about 70 days, would be out of view, and then it would re-emerge, and back then it would re-emerge on the summer solstice again, a connection to the flood there. So there's just some of the constellation art, Orion's belt, Sirius in Canis Major, the dog star is why it's called, and Canopus down here in Argus Navi, as it used to be. He also points out that they found a lot of temple sites that were at 45 degrees off, so 45, 135, 90 plus 45, 180 plus 45 is 220, etc. That's earlier episode I talked about Abydos and that the angle reflecting that 345 triangle of Khufu. Well, just off to the side is this satellite complex, and that's tilted at 45 degrees. They propose it has something to do with precession, but also back in Thebes, I mentioned all the major sites except for the Ramesseum. The Ramesseum is also at a 45 degrees, very, very close to that angle, and that's of course where the statue of Ozymandias, look on my works here, mighty and despair. So they have this 45 degree as well as the other important angles, and that's also in Komombo Temple. That's angled also at, or very, very, very close to 45 degrees. Now in Belmonte and his team had some ideas of what that is, but essentially it's cardinal points midway between them. So that's if you do your alignment, you hold a 90 degree, it's a builder square, set square. You also get your north, south, east and west from those positions quite easily. Of course, all this goes back to relationships to the flood, of course. Links to these papers, of course, will be posted in the description. But finally, what's worth considering is, so what we have is this graph which shows all of the 330 temples across the length and breadth and width of Egypt. Then it's Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, and the oases and desert region. So each region of Egypt, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt have a different natural profile. The animal migrations, bird migrations, the fish and animal life are different. And then we have the oases and desert region, which again has a different rhythm of life that needs to be considered. So all of the temples, Lower Egypt clears, massive spike here, and then we see that connections, you could overlay Lower and Upper Egypt, a lot of similarities, but Upper Egypt and the oases and desert region also have some, for instance, very low spike. Then we get higher here and higher here, so the connections between the two. So Lower Egypt is a land of lakes and marshes, a massive Nile delta. Of course, it's delta, so it's on the Mediterranean Sea, so you're going to have brackish and salt water, so different fish and animal, dolphins and sharks, probably whales back in the day. This massive marsh would be a migration for nesting birds. The eels and water snakes and the food sources and the plant life would be very, very different from Egypt below this point, because not just the salt water, just the amount of water and the green. Now, because of modern irrigation, this river would have been broken up into divided up into many more streams. There's only really about 3 or 4 major branches that reach into the river, into the Mediterranean, but also the nature of the region, also the culture of a region, because these people would have been connected to the Mediterranean, people born in the Mediterranean. They are much closer to them, shorter distance to travel than what it would be to get to the cataracts in Lower Egypt, for instance. But now Lower Egypt is a different place to Upper Egypt, where the Nile and the agriculture on the Nile is so important, but you go a short distance away from the Nile and you're in desert. So therefore the animal life, the nature would insist that there are clear differences between Lower and Upper Egypt, culturally and also by the nature of the world in itself. Now also we have the desert and oases. So for instance the oasis at Siwa, these people would be again have a different light. So they're living around wells, and the oases and their hunting patterns and grazing get very, very different. So we also have like a third type of nature being which would affect the culture, the mythos, and the alignments of those temples, and that clearly shows up in the work by Belmonte. Now, for instance, we see Lower Egypt very low at this part of the spike, but the oases and Upper Egypt, which are more orientated towards a desert lifestyle, as opposed to Lower Egypt, which is marshes and lakes and lots of water, salt water included. And so they, again, they would array themselves differently. So that the arrival of birds, movements of animals, you would want your calendar systems and your archaeoastronomy to reflect nature. We'll go into it more in next episodes and looking at the pyramid texts and coffin texts and how they clearly reflect an animist type of culture or religion, where it's related to natural cycles as opposed to trying to impose human cycles on and create a mythos from that. But what we have, again, clear evidence is by studying so many of these sites, it's apparent. And it's apparent when you look at the actual biology, the geography of these places as well, why it would be so evident that this would have to be arranged in this particular type of way. Okay, so that's it for this particular episode, because I just think it's vital to understand the natural environment and the cycles of the Sun, Earth, and Moon. Now also in these particular studies they're looking at, as he even specifies, at basically solar alignments, Equinox and Solstice, and a few of the major stars that were known and recorded in the older texts. There are also lunar events to consider and planetary events to consider, but that's again very massive task to undertake. There's only a small group of people such as Magli and Belmonte and their associates which are doing this type of work. It's still just generally not accepted. Not that it's not accepted, it's not given the seriousness and the investment that it should. I should specify that. So anyway, with that, I hope you enjoyed, and this information will be vital in looking at the pyramid plans and pyramid arrangements as well. More to come on that. Thank you for watching and have a good one. And you can want to support this channel. I go to PayPal, SGD Sacred Geometry, and any contributions you can make, much appreciated. Thank you for watching. Cheers.